ago, the indigenous people got their declaration, got a lot of different spaces in the United Nations, like the expert mechanism, the permanent forum, how they got an international decade, an international year. So everybody, I think, in the room looks to you in a kind of leadership role. How did you do it? What did you do? How on earth did you get that declaration on the run? And so on. So maybe we could start off by kind of just an open question to you, and then there'll be some questions from the panel and from all of us. You know, what was the story of the declaration for the Indigenous? How did it all start, and what were some of the obstacles?
Well, that's those are a lot of questions in one, and I could go in many different directions. I think to understand though the declaration, indigenous peoples of course have experienced a lot of human rights violations, you know, and ever since in North America, since European contact and beyond, going back even to the Papal Bull that said that indigenous peoples you know, didn't own the land if they weren't Christian. So the struggle that indigenous people had, you know, having their own identity and their own land, their own territory, their own governing systems and stuff like that, was always under assault by in contact with colonial government. And over the years, you know, there's a tremendous amount of mistrust what indigenous people have with governments. And at all levels, local level, you know, regional level, international levels, we you know, there's a tremendous amount of mistrust. You know, broken treaties. You know, we were victims of dispossession, disempowerment, genocide. So what indigenous people experience with states made us be very, very careful. So when we came to Geneva in 1977. We were looking for justice. We were looking for how can we fix the situation why can't indigenous people have a voice at the United Nations? And so that started a whole process. And we won allies. The United Nations created the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982, and the first thing that indigenous people asked was a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. What are our rights? Or because states were saying that, academics, not just states, but academics were saying that indigenous people were not subjects of international law, and that indigenous people were not peoples. We were populations, that groups, you know, bands, you know. Without the right of self-determination. So the struggle began there. We tried to convince states that of who we are. First, I can't say we were convincing states. We had to convince the Working Group on Indigenous Populations of 5 human rights experts. However, you know, they were a body made by the United Nations, and therefore they represented the United Nations to us. And the United Nations is a private club of states. So, and we were trying to knocking on the door of this private club. So, one of the things that indigenous peoples wanted to do was, if we wanted to influence government and the United Nations in particular, was that we wanted to walk in there in solidarity. We wanted to walk in there in any negotiation in a unified position, that all indigenous peoples would be together. And this would avoid the situation of states and the United Nations trying to divide and conquer the indigenous movement by corralling so many indigenous people on one side against indigenous people who might be on the other side. So indigenous people in the Working Group on Indigenous Population used to meet for 1 week, for 5 days, from Monday to Friday. And there, just indigenous peoples and our supporters, non-indigenous lawyers and activists, academics, we would draft the articles that we wanted in the UN Declaration, that articulated all our rights. And by coming together in unity, by deciding what those rights are, and it gave Indigenous people a very, very strong position in convincing the 5 human rights experts that made up the working group of what those rights should be. And it was very, very effective that way. And Indigenous peoples, we don't all speak English. We speak Spanish, French, Russian, and what we managed to, with the help of volunteer interpreters, we were able to, at the beginning, at least manage in English and in Spanish, and because we all have a common history, all Indigenous people have been dispossessed and disempowered. And that gave everybody a sense of purpose, a sense of unity, that we all had the shared experience. All we had to do now was take that shared experience and fashion text and words that would reflect what was happening to us and what we felt our rights are. And so I think this solidarity went a long way into convincing, first of all, the 5 experts and later on the state, that when you walk into a room and start negotiating for our rights as Indigenous peoples, we had to walk in there in solidarity, and that we went in there with a solid position, and this made it difficult for states and others to undermine our position. And so we thought that this is a very, very effective way of gaining the declaration. If I can skip forward to the working group on the draft declaration, which was negotiations with states, we maintained that the strong solidarity when states were trying to water down the declaration. We did the same kind of strategy that we did with the working group on indigenous population. We would meet ahead of time, and globally we decided a strategy that we would not want any changes to the declaration, the draft declaration that was produced by the working group on indigenous population. And with this as our strategy, we walked into the room with states and tried to object to any changes from states. But we had a problem. At the working group on the draft declaration, which was a Commission on Human Rights body at the time, we had no voice in that room. And we were in danger of really, really having the declaration watered down and changed. So as a strategy, Indigenous people, we walked out of the negotiation, and this caused a dilemma for the chairman of the working group, because the resolution that created the working group said that they would elaborate a declaration of the rights of Indigenous peoples with the participation of Indigenous peoples. So if we're not in the room, then they can't elaborate a declaration.
Kenneth, I have a question. Kenneth, I have a question. Here in this room, there are recognition that a number of governments are very hostile to their cause. I'm not going to mention the countries particularly, it's not important, but they have a lot of enemies out there, especially some of the Asian countries. So can you tell us a little bit about how you maneuvered with the countries, looking for the friendly countries? How did you deal with countries who are very hostile? Like, I won't mention the ones that are hostile necessarily, but one of them might have been the United States and the other might have been Canada. How did you deal with those hostile countries, and how did you try to build alliances with countries you found might be sympathetic to your cause?
I think the hostile countries, at one time or another, I put almost all of them in that. Because of government policy, changes in government, sometimes you have a friendly government, and then there's an election, and then you have a hostile government. So it was like who was friendly sometimes was a moving target. what we did, a lot of initially, we had to focus domestically inside the country to convince countries to change their position. For instance, in Canada, we would meet in Canada with the Foreign Affairs and with the Department of Indian Affairs and Justice Department, and we would debate with them the rights that are in the Declaration, and then we would try to convince Canada to make sure that that they would support the rights that are in the draft declaration. The same thing was done with the United States to a certain extent. I think Canada was more open to discussion than the United States was, but still, Indigenous people in the United States talked with the government of the United States before meetings happened in the United Nations. So that was helpful. The same thing was tried in a number of other countries, in like say Asia, Africa, like South Africa, which was probably our friendliest government on that continent, and it had a lot of influence in those years, in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so South Africa recognized Indigenous people. They recognized the Khoisan people as being Indigenous. So that was helpful. And also the Congo would recognize the Indigenous peoples. And so these kinds of countries were able to gain influence in those regions that were perhaps a little hostile to the rights of Indigenous peoples. In Asia, we had to rely on, that was difficult in Asia. For instance, Japan has Indigenous peoples, or the Ainu in northern Japan. And even there, Japan, as progressive as a country, that is very, very difficult to really recognize that it was so obvious that they were. And Japan would waver. Sometimes they would say yes, they're Indigenous, and sometimes, well, maybe they're not. But in the end, I mean, we're still trying to get Japan today to recognize Indigenous, the Ainu and Indigenous people, recognizing all the rights that they have. However, Japan became at least not hostile to Indigenous rights, but far more supportive. Some of the other Asian states, though, that were difficult. Pakistan, India. India, as you can see, had an ongoing war with the Naga people of northern India, and the Naga people were saying that they were Indigenous, and so India was a bit of a problem, for them. But the Ainu, I mean, the Naga came to Geneva in force. They said not numerous. The Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People has been very useful, and I think that it has been. It could be more useful if people learn how to use it correctly. I think that the Declaration has given momentum to Indigenous people in the domestic situation that they find themselves in. And particularly, I think courts are now taking a good view. Courts are taking the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into consideration when talking about land issues and rights issues for Indigenous people. And I've always said that if the government doesn't want to recognize the Declaration, the courts can recognize the Declaration, and I think that the implementation of the Declaration over time, it's the courts will decide whether it will be applied or not. And the courts have been very, very favorable to the Declaration because it's as obvious. The Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is so righteous that it's hard to argue against it, and it's very, very useful for Indigenous peoples to gain the rights of that. that they have. In Canada, there's a legislation that was passed Bill C-15 that attempts to implement the declaration in Canadian law and Canadian policy. It doesn't go quite far enough, as some of us believe. However, it's a step forward that where a state can recognize the UN Declaration. Bolivia has made the declaration as part of its constitution, and there are other states that are taking a hard look. Those with high indigenous population numbers, are taking a hard look at the declaration as being part of somehow incorporated into their legislation. So there are some good examples where the declaration is being successful and will continue to be successful in the future. There is no single silver bullet that'll solve everybody's human rights issues. I like the chairman of the working group on the draft declaration when it was finally passed at the press conference. He said, "Don't use the declaration as a club to be the heads of governments over the heads of governments, but use it as a tool to get what you want." And that's the way I think you have to look at it, like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as a tool to get what you need and get what you want, and it can be applied differently to different peoples. That flexibility enough so that some people have more of a priority of certain rights than other rights, and some people live in different realities and have to be approached in a more flexible and a more flexible way. So to answer your question, I think that the rights of indigenous people have advanced a lot, and I know there are some critics of the declaration. And I know there are some people who say the declaration hasn't done enough or hasn't done anything. But if you look at the situation of indigenous peoples today from 1977, when indigenous peoples have showed up at the UN looking for their rights, a lot has happened in those always intervening years, 45 years. And I think there's a lot of advancement and there's a lot of hope that I look at the future, hopefully, for the Declaration of the Rights of these people to help everybody at one time or another.
Thank you, Kenneth. There may be some questions from the people here. So can you?
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. Can I ask if there are any questions for Kenneth so that we get the ball rolling? Maybe we can hear. Can you hear? No, you can hear me, right? Can you hear me? Yes. Sorry, I was off mic a moment. We're going to have maybe I'll get 2 or 3 questions, and then if you listen, and then we'll give you space to answer them. Yeah, Bianca. Bianca.
Hello, Kenneth. Thank you for that very inspiring presentation of yours.
Can you hear? I mean, could you check?
I can hear her.
Okay. So I have a very fundamental question for you. We all know that the indigenous people are not a homogeneous group, and they're quite diverse, spanning across the globe. So how did you arrive at common political positions? Was that a huge challenge? Or you did say that it was a shared experience and because of the historical injustices you face as communities across the globe. But how difficult was it, and how long did it take for you all to arrive at common, with a shared vision and common positions on issues?
And then another question?
We will take another question, Kenneth, just to let you know, and then you may answer to make it a little bit more easy. Thank you.
My question and clarification is the outcome of declaration. What is the outcome of this declaration? How it is being received by the non-tribal community as well as the government agencies' response in implementing this declaration? Thank you.
Okay, can I answer?
Maybe two more.
We will take maybe 2 more questions and then you may answer. That's okay.
I'm going to forget some of these questions by the time we go. All right.
Just 2 small questions. Number 1 is, what was the role of the general public of the indigenous people in this whole process? Of course, there were leaders and so on who were involved, or experts, but in what way were the general public was involved in this process? Number 2, any key factors that facilitated the process of advocacy work? Any key factors that would be of use to us also that really facilitated this whole process? Thank you.
Maybe let him answer.
You can go ahead if you wish, Kenneth, to answer the questions that have been posed so
sorry,
far.
I thought you were saying go ahead to somebody else.
Sorry, man. Since you can see me, I understand. I apologize.
I'm going to try and answer these questions. If I don't answer them right, ask them again. First of all, the last question is about the gender roles, and I was, I come from a matrilineal society, where women have a lot of power and influence, and I saw that in the indigenous movement in general. A lot of strong women and strong men as well are taking leadership roles. The influence of I did not see so much of a gender issue in some of the regions, but in some regions, though, I thought there was a lot of male dominance. The men were delegations that come from certain regions were mostly, if not all men at the beginning, and then that changed. But over time, that changed, and you saw a change, a sea change as time went on. There was more and more women coming forward, and I would refer to Asia as like that, and the same thing with Africa, where the delegations were heavily male. And now I see it over the years, as you can see, there's been a lot of leadership from the female side. So in terms of gender, I think that there's been, I think it's quite balanced, and it wasn't always like that at the beginning globally, but I think it's far more balanced today. And when you look at the non-indigenous side, and you look at the human rights movement, you'll see, I think, a preponderance of females in that movement in general. If you look at the arena internationally, you'll see a lot of women. Sometimes I would say 55% at least 55% of activists are female, and the rest male. So in terms of gender, I see a strong female. Maybe because it's the issue, human rights are a very emotional issue, and women have that strong, that they use that passion to the argument, to the issues of human rights. I see myself a tremendous amount of balance between the genders. It wasn't always like that, but today I see that. What are the key factors? Again, solidarity, walking into the room with states and having one voice, going in there and not allowing states to divide us, not to pit, one region against another. It wasn't easy. I think that the other issue about how do we deal with difficult issues, we hammered out those differences in the caucus, and since we all have different experiences, the Asian experience is different from the North American experience, and the Arctic is different from Africa. But we tried to settle those differences, and we learned how to draft texts that were not region specific, that they were so generic that they could be applied anywhere. If you look at the text of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the text does not really focus on any one particular region, regional issue. It is heavy on individual rights, which is perhaps a Western concept. However, that's the human rights field that we use today in general. But it wasn't always easy. There were quite some shouting matches, and there were some some animosity that tended to be built up. But we tried to work by consensus. We try. I think consensus building is a skill. It's something that it takes a certain amount of diplomacy. It has to use like good words with one another. In our tradition, you got to use words that don't cut or hurt other people. And when you have a difference of opinion, a different of a point of view, we try to resolve those differences diplomatically. And indigenous peoples have a tradition of diplomacy. Non-indigenous people didn't like diplomacy. So we have our traditions, we have our ways of dealing with conflict and with issues that can divide our people. And we had to learn how to use those at the international level with each other. One of the issues that did cause a problem early on was interpretation. Because we didn't have any money, indigenous people are not wealthy, and we would come to Geneva and we would meet and we would rely on our friends to interpret for us. And they were well-meaning and stuff like that, and they would interpret, and we didn't pay them. It was free. You can't complain about free labor. However, in the meeting, we felt particularly like the Spanish-speaking people were going in one direction, and the English-speaking people were going in a slightly different direction, and we couldn't figure out why was that happening. And then the Spanish-speaking people were very suspicious of the English-speaking indigenous people. And then we found out that it was interpretation, that the interpreters, well-meaning as they are, were not professional, and were not very interpreting all the fine points and the nuance in the languages. And sometimes the interpreters are injecting their own personal opinion into interpretation. So that was causing us problems. So that was resolved by European support groups supplying us with professional interpretation, the GFoD. And once you have professional interpreters, it solved that problem of misinterpretation, misunderstandings between different language groups. Right? Yeah, I think they're all related. I think the same question in some way. I think I'll title the first question that was asked about. It used the word caste, and that I'm assuming I'm interpreting this question as saying that in the North-South divide, I guess, where developed countries and developing countries it is an issue. It's a problem. People from developed countries have better access, perhaps, to the levers of power in the United Nations, such as it is, and I think though that I see it as something that has changed a lot. In the beginning, there was really the movement, the international movement included North America, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe some of the Pacific Islands, and the Sami, and we saw very little from the Asian and the African indigenous people. And that changed in the 1990s. In the 1990s, you saw a greater participation of indigenous peoples from other continents that were not there in the 1980s. And so that was a development. And the globalization of indigenous people, and it took time to adjust to that. The conflict started, particularly, I'll give you an example over the study on treaties and the treaty study, which did not include indigenous people from Asia and Africa in the study, and that created this what you're talking about, this caste system, where they felt that the people from Asia and Africa were different from the indigenous peoples from other parts of the world, and perhaps we're all different because maybe we had a different kind of colonization, perhaps, and a different relationship with the colonizers and the invaders. So our relationships are different in that way, and so we and it is an economic divide as well that has might restrict poverty, could restrict the participation of indigenous peoples from certain regions, certain areas to participate. However, it's all a struggle. And we all have that same struggle about priorities and how much effort and work do we want to put in at the international level. Whether you come from whatever region you want to come to, you have to make a decision on how much effort, how much work do you want to put in at the international level, and what do you expect to get out of it. So where you come from, it's the effort that you put into it. That will bear the results. If you put more effort into it, the more results that you will get. In terms of, we know that the experiences and the terminology that we use is different in the different parts of the world, and that's why some of the phraseology in the UN Declaration is different, has to be taken into consideration. For instance, indigenous peoples in North America, we call ourselves nations and governments, and we have a right to strongly self-determination, and we use the word sovereignty. But we know that, and we understand that other regions here, particularly in Asia, you could get killed if you start talking as you're a nation and that you have sovereignty and that you're governments and that states can look at you as a subversive element and target it that way. So we have to couch our languages carefully between the real situation on the ground in some regions and the situation on the ground in other regions. Or some regions are just more free to express themselves, in other places where they're far more suppressed. And we have to be careful with the language that we use when we're dealing with states and dealing with the United Nations. And that's an issue of the realities of some people. So we have to choose our words carefully when we make global statements that include everybody. And that's difficult. It's very, very difficult to tell somebody, say, from North America, say, don't call yourself a nation, don't call yourself a government, because if people in Asia start doing that, they could get killed, they could be in prison. So those compromises in language can be difficult to negotiate when we're coming up to global statements and global positions. So we use words that are very broad and inclusive. Self-determination is a phrase, is a term that is broadly used, that we all indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination, as in Article 3 in the Declaration. However, what does self-determination mean? And self-determination can mean many, many, many things. It could mean autonomy, it could mean self-government, it could mean sovereignty, it could mean independence. It's such a broad issue. So that's how we use words that can be inclusive of everybody's position. And so that takes diplomacy, and it takes tactics. It takes a very clear thinking. It takes cooperation and understanding why we use certain words in certain situations, and why some people might say, gee, the language is a little weak in this part or that part. But the language has to be that way in order to protect and the indigenous people in certain parts of the world that if we use too strong a language would endanger their very lives. So those are the kind of things that we have to take into consideration at the international level to make sure that we gain the rights that we have, that we are entitled to, at the same time as not endangering the indigenous people who are trying to gain those rights in some regions where they're very continue to be oppressed and subject to paramilitaries and outright armies of state military apparatus. So we have to be careful in those negotiations. And we speaking from somebody from the north, we have to take those into the consideration of all other regions when we deal.
Kenneth? I think we've just got one more question, and then we can free. Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon. Did you want to just finish off the second question? I didn't.
Well, one of the things about somebody said numbers that you have high numbers, and that's true. You do, but numbers are in your favor in terms of your relationships in your region. However, from an indigenous perspective, an indigenous people, whether there are a small number or a large number, are equal. And it's that equality with one indigenous people is more numerous than another indigenous people. Doesn't mean they have more rights than the other. That's not. That would be against the indigenous people, the rights of indigenous people, if you start playing a numbers game. And we're all equal as peoples. All indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, and regardless of the numbers. So I would just be cautious on how you use numbers as leverage. It's good to use that leverage when you're dealing with the states in your area. Be careful if you're trying to use it for leverage with other indigenous peoples, because we are all equal, no matter what the numbers are, and that all refers to unity. That we have to have respect, mutual respect for one another. That indigenous people respect each other. Indigenous people to be who they are, to be different, but at the same time to be indigenous and have common goals and objectives. Okay, Julian.
Thank you, Kenneth. I think there was one more question, if that's okay, and then we can free you up to go have an early night.
Oh, thank you so much for giving us so much of rich experience of building of the movement of indigenous community. I have few questions in my mind. I just want to understand there is a thin line between race and the indigenous community when we're talking about. I hope I'm making a point. So there is something about the terminology of how we came with that identity of indigenous, because if you translate into the local languages, it's difficult to say what does indigenous means for someone who may not be knowing English, if I'm not mistaken what I'm saying. But because I think indigenous have their own identity in their particular countries, like we have aboriginals, or we have Native Americans, and in India, I come from India, so we have Adivasis. So that's something I can see that's a challenge which one can perceive when we are talking about the UN terminology vis-a-vis the state identities or the representation of these communities within their own countries. The last question which I have is the role of religion, because indigenous people, they believe in nature. That's how, and how this the religious supremacy in terms of a particular religion dominating the religious identity of indigenous communities. So was there a role of religious institutions in building up the movement of indigenous communities at the UN? Thank you.
Was the question, did religion play a role in?
Yeah.
All right, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah. How should I answer this? I think indigenous peoples have their own spirituality, and and I don't like to use the word religion so much because religion really refers to businesses. Like religions are a business, at least in our experience, and so I look at our belief system as a spirituality, that we have that relationship. And one of the first things that we said, indigenous people said when we came in 1977 was, when our message to the United Nations was, who speaks for the animals? Who speaks for the birds? Who speaks for the fish? Who's speaking for the waters? Who in the United Nations is speaking for the natural world? And as indigenous peoples, we feel that that was our role. That we were bringing a voice of the natural world to the United Nations, because we are so connected and so close to the natural world, that we feel that we have a duty and a responsibility to bring the voices of the natural world to the United Nations. And that's still today. That's still the whole issues of biodiversity and climate change and all these issues are related to those. If the governments had listened to us in 1977, you wouldn't have the climate crisis that we have today. So in terms of religion and spirituality, in that way, we have a lot to offer and about the natural world that we indigenous people live in, and that is not reflected in the United Nations. That's why we're here. Because one of the roles of indigenous people in the United Nations is to bring the voice of the natural world into the UN system, and it's been effective. Today, climate change movements are saying that we have to listen to indigenous people if we want to save the planet, and that's a reflection of that closeness and relationship that we have with the natural world. And that's a spiritual relationship. And it's reflected in what they call a religion, in many cases. The other role of religion, though, I guess, is the larger religions of the colonizers, whether it was Christianity, Muslim, other our religion. I have to say, I did not, in the indigenous movement, I did not see a division along those lines. Maybe that I wasn't looking, but when it comes to religion, we were sort of religiously neutral. We avoided the issues we understood the ravages of colonial religions on our people, but we did not pass judgment on people who might be practicing those religions. We didn't see those kind of differences of battles taking place very much. I'm not saying they weren't there, but they were settled inside the caucus and settled quietly and not publicly. Because there is still today, friction between those that follow our traditional religions and those that follow the mainstream movement. So there's friction there, absolutely. But as being tolerant people, we have to recognize that it's very hard to challenge a person's beliefs. Their religion it's something that's very personal, and so we have avoided those kind of issues between indigenous peoples of various different religions. We've managed to keep that at bay, and I haven't seen an effect of it. One of the things that indigenous people gain, as you'll note in the MRF and other meetings, is that we have a traditional indigenous open, and we have been telling it, and the United Nations, there's a lot of resistance to that. We started doing that at the Working Group on Indigenous Population. And they're saying that, well, they don't pray in the United Nations. You know, there's no prayer because there's all kinds of people of various religions, and no religion should be any kind of priority over one over the other. And so what we tell the United Nations is that we're not praying. When we do an opening, we give an acknowledgement to creation. We give a thanksgiving to all of creation. You know, the plants, the animals, the waters, the four winds, the sun and the moon. So it's a Thanksgiving. It's the Thanksgiving address. And so that's how we make inroads into bringing the natural world into the UN system. And without really it being looked at as a religion. It's just an acknowledgement of the reality, an acknowledgement of the natural world that's around us. And any decisions that we make as Indigenous peoples and as non-Indigenous peoples and as the United Nations, we should be making considering the natural world in our decisions so that we do not destroy the natural world that sustains us. So in terms of that's what I have to say about religion in the UN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I know it's quite late in Geneva, and I know you have a lot of meetings over the weekend as well, because you're going to be in your caucuses, trying to get unity amongst all of the Indigenous delegates there for the meeting ahead. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much for taking some time out late at night, and I think we all benefited from your experiences. Thank you very much.
I wish I could have answered some of those questions better. But at 10 o'clock at night, that's the best I can do right now.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it has been, I think you answered from your experience and your deep conviction. That's what really matters. Thank you very much.